back in 2018, just before the World Championship tournament. Just after the release of Opus 7, Hobby Japan heard the outcry from the community and made history with the advent of Final Fantasy TCG's first card ban. Not only did they make the decision to ban a card, the decision was made to ban two. This is the story of how Opus 5 Thaumaturge and Opus 5 Gasper became banned. If you play Final Fantasy TCG, there's a very good chance that you've purchased cards from Nerd Labs already. Nerd Labs has nearly 2,000 completed sales in just over the last 11 months or so, with overwhelmingly positive feedback. We're on TCG Player, but just as a little hint, if you follow the link in the description, there's no price floor when prices are updated on a daily basis. Always happy to support the stack. Let's get back to the video. To make things clear, I was not around for the banning of either of these cards. My experience with these cards is basically zero, but I've been listening to a lot of old podcasts from the RVA returners, and I find it fascinating how things have evolved since they started recording around the Opus 4 era. Because of this, I only intend to try to convey the power of these cards as they had in their contextual decks, and then kind of plan to take a look at how they would fare in today's Opus 22 landscape. To really take you back to 2018, we need to get in the mindset that mono ice discard has been an archetype for the last few opuses, and it has only grew in popularity with the release of Opus 5. At the time, Opus 5 was widely regarded as one of the first opuses that really accelerated a lot of the mechanics in Final Fantasy TCG's landscape and really changed the game as a whole. Opus 5 gave birth to the main focuses of this video, of course, Thaumaturge and Gasper. So let's take a look at both of these and see what we're working with here. Thaumaturge is a 2 CP ice forward job standard unit from category 14. With only 1,000 power, we're not really swinging for the fences or anything, but we do have a healthy bit of effect text. Essentially, when we play Thaumaturge, our opponent is going to discard one card. Once they have 2 or less cards in hand, we gain 4,000 power, putting us slightly under curve at 5,000 power if we did pay that 2 CP. There is a concept in Final Fantasy TCG around the realized cost of a card. A non-light and dark card that you have in hand has a value of 2 CP when you discard it. And if we discard a card to play a 2 CP card, we have actually given up 4 CP in resources to do so. We plan to make a video going over this concept a lot more in depth in the future, but for now we'll touch on this at kind of like a high level in this video. So in the case of Thaumaturge, if you pay 2 CP and cast the card, you've effectively removed 2 CP from your hand to place it onto the field. After we've successfully cast Thaumaturge, our opponent is actually going to discard a card, and this means that we've effectively removed 2 CP from our opponent's resources, which means that we're in sort of kind of a way only losing 2 CP against our opponent's CP by doing so. So in Final Fantasy TCG, of course, this is a big deal because the entire game focuses on managing our resources, and it's kind of hard to manage those resources if your opponent doesn't give you a chance to do so. So now that we've established that Thaumaturge entering the field creates a devastating swing in resources for your opponent, imagine that if you can do this 3 times on turn 1. Yep. So because Thaumaturge has that generic icon in the top right, you can actually play up to 3 copies of him onto the field at once. If I'm going first and draw all 3 Thaumaturge on turn 1, then I can discard a card, play a copy of Thaumaturge, making my opponent discard a card. Then I can discard a card, play a copy of Thaumaturge, making my opponent discard a card. And then I can discard a card to play a copy of Thaumaturge, making my opponent discard 3 cards total on literally turn 1. On their subsequent turn, they draw 2 cards, but effectively they have less resources than I did for their first chance to even play a character. So at the time, we didn't have effects in Final Fantasy TCG like we do today. It's not like I can discard 2 cards to play a 4 CP forward, which then plays a card from the break zone, which then would let me draw a card. You don't have those lines in Final Fantasy at the time. You couldn't discard 2 cards to play Leo from your Limit Break deck to manifest a blocking body and then still draw a card. You had 4 cards in your hand and you were expected to find a way to dig yourself out of this hole now. So on top of all this, now let's look at Gasper, a 2CP monster with both the Theorhythm and Final Fantasy VIII categories. A simple line of effect text that, for a simple dole, each player then discards a card from their hand. Thoughtfully, you can only do this once per turn, except wait, that pesky generic icon is present in the top right again, meaning optimally, I can do this 3 times per turn. Also keep in mind that, unlike forwards, monsters mechanically do not carry Summoning Sickness, meaning that they could use this on the same turn that they play Gasper. In an even more toxic opening than before, if I were to open with all 3 Gaspers, I might just play them all and then dole them all down to make us both discard 3 cards total. But wait, don't I have to discard 2? Nope. So because of the effect structure here, the only cost that's being paid is that Gasper must be active and has to become dull to activate the effect. Once the cost is paid and the effect enters the stack, both players are expected to discard, but if I have nothing in hand, I lose nothing, and as long as you have a card in hand, you lose 2 CP. I don't want to forget to mention that Gasper's controller had the ability to add this effect on the stack in various ways, to where if I wanted to do something interesting like search for a card or do something that would add cards to my hand, I could actually activate Gasper to force that effect to go on the stack so that we would both have to discard a card while I have 0 cards in hand, and then resolve that effect that searches for the card so that I get the card in hand while you lose a card in hand. So going back just slightly to our realized cost concept from earlier, Gasper poses a more potent threat. I ultimately pay 4 CP for Gasper, right? 2 CP paid, and then 2 CP is actually removed from my hand. Then I can dole Gasper to remove 2 CP from my opponent every single turn. So what this does is it sets up a scenario where the longer that Gasper stays in play, the more value I strip away from my opponent. If Gasper enters and remains on the field over the course of a 10-turn game, I would essentially have taken 20 CP away from my opponent. And let's now multiply that by 3, because let's say that I open with all 3 of them. I could essentially remove 60 CP away from my opponent over the course of the game. And that just doesn't really seem fair, does it? Putting these 2 cards together really created a board state where you could easily get your opponent down to 1 or 2 cards in hand by turn 2, and from there easily keep their hand at 0. This really creates a non-interactive game, basically allowing me to do whatever I want, and the only response that you could have is something that you're forced to play on the field and give me that information is kind of rough, right? There's 0 hidden information that you can keep from me, and that's a very powerful tool in the right hands. Alright, so let's take a look at the other 44 cards in our deck to look at kind of what a deck built around these 2 cards look like. So we're actually going to take a look at both Chris Lopez and Elijah Teo's decks. Both of these are from the latter parts of 2018, and focusing on these lists, we can deduce a lot of the game plan and just how quickly these decks intend to get off the ground. And both decks are playing a really low number of backups, meaning that we don't want to take too much time to get set up. We just really don't want to keep a lot of CP in our hands, which means that we kind of need to be relatively low to the ground. So if we look at the higher costed cards here, both lists are actually running Opus 1 Sephiroth and Opus 3 Sidal Stain, both of which have powerful effects focusing on getting cards out of our opponent's hand or punishing an opponent when they don't have anything in their hand. Feels a bit unfair when the whole point of our game plan is to keep the opponent's cards at 0, and they kind of get punished for already being punished, right? Both lists do have a slightly similar but also varied 4-cost lineup. Both lists dedicate spots to the DGS forwards, which simply kind of just help build up your forward line to be even more powerful. So remember that Thaumaturge has 5,000 power once our opponent gets down to 2 or less cards in hand, but with the DGS Trooper here, we actually add 2,000 power to that. That's also on top of the Deep Ground Soldiers here that search for our Trooper First Class. They also would get that 2,000 power buff as well. We do also have Genesis in both lists, and he has been widely regarded as one of the best ice cards in a long time. He was very prevalent all the way up through Opus 6, Opus 7, Opus 8, and was widely regarded as just top-notch in terms of ice cards. We also do have Vayne here, which kind of helps lock out like rogue-style decks. I won't say that there were too many decks out there that were playing forwards of 5 or more, but this just kind of helped seal the deal against any kind of like rogue stuff that you would see, just because it won't let them activate during the controller's active phase. Both lists do end up running a small Final Fantasy VIII package that consists of Squall and Laguna in some capacity. The Opus 6 Squall here is definitely the star, as he gains haste at the top end of our plan when our opponent does have 2 or less cards in hand. Laguna helping us search for the Squall helps consistency, and then we have Renoa. And Renoa was one of those cards that put the opponent on the back foot in such an odd way. If I have something close to lethal on board, I can play Renoa and then essentially force you to take chip damage by not blocking her, or if you do, all the forwards would then become dull and then I can just push for game. Lastly, we do round out the forward lineup with both Argath in both lists, and this kind of just helps keep our opponents low on cards, of course. And then Elijah actually slotted in a few Opus 1 Snows, which just help dull down the bigger guys on the opponent's field so that they can make contact with things like Genesis to again help strip cards away from our opponent. Summons are fairly similar between both lists, with Opus 5 Mateus and Opus 3 Shiva to help keep the field clear. Backups are also fairly similar, except Chris opting to run a few more backups than Elijah. Both lists do run Kazuza from Opus 3, who discards. Then you have something like Chris running Harley and Edward here. Edward obviously is going to help discard cards and also has that beautiful special to cancel any kind of summons. And then Harley making the Edward just 1 CP to play onto the field. That's if you can go back to our realized cost. If I pay 1 CP to play the Edward, I'm effectively paying 3 CP, right? Tap 1 and remove 2 CP from my hand, and then they are also removing 2 CP from their hand as well. So that's a pretty good conversion rate when I get to then develop a backup that's going to recur me resources over the next few turns of the game. Elijah also did choose to not run either Edward or Harley, but actually runs the Opus 1 Jill Nabat, which does feel like something of a mirror breaker in the sense that in the mirror match, as the opponent is pushing and trying to do this damage, she will actually punish them by freezing some forwards. Just an overall really good showstopper in terms of like any aggressive type of plan here. So now let's actually zoom out just a little bit. Let's look at the whole picture here. So there are 7 different names spanning 18 cards out of the 50 that are going to have some sort of discard effect attached to them, 3 of which can be repeated every turn. With an optimal board state, you're forcing 4 discards per turn very easily for multiple turns in a row. You could lock your opponent out from playing the game very, very easily. And on top of that, the earlier that you do this, the easier it is to kind of seal the deal and your opponent can't do anything. You are going to run away with the game. To contextualize the decks that Mono Ice was going up against, let's take a look at the 2018 World Championship Tournament results. So this tournament was a 3-deck format, meaning that each competitor had to bring 3 decks, a total of 150 cards, and out of those 150 cards, you couldn't have more than 3 copies of a single serialized card. And there seemed to be quite a bit of contention around this style of format at the time, but ultimately this drove players to bring decks that were focused on a mono-style deck, or at most a dual-element deck. Taking a look at the top 4 finishers in the event, you have Alex Hancock's, Jamie Faulkner, Lewis, Brandon Burnett, and Taiki Harigai. In such a twist, each one of these individuals brought Mono Ice with them, but let's focus on the other decks that were a Worlds level deck at the time. So Earth Wind is a deck focusing on Opus 4 Dataluma. So this card in particular, which I can't get too heavy into this card because there is going to be a video about how this card ultimately met its demise as well, paired with this Opus 4 monster, you essentially could have 3 1,000 pings that you could assign to Dataluma, and then Dataluma in return, if you dealt him 3k 3 different times, he could in turn dish out 4,000 damage 3 different times. So you could effectively remove up to a 12k from the board. So Earthwind has multiple tools to help you get to a board state for this to be optimal, but it's also a very control-y type deck in and of itself, right? So Opus 5 Wool really drove home the just turn off an entire mechanic effect with being able to turn off the EX burst, which is huge. Opus 5 Diabolos for effectively tapping down all of your backups, you got to either choose a 4 to 5 or more and just straight break it, or you could choose a 4 to 4 or less, and then its power becomes 1,000, which is relevant because Cactuar could then ping it down. So you could effectively remove anything from the board that was going to be a problem for you, and then you got to activate all the forwards you control or activate all the backups you control. You got to pick 2 out of those 4 fancy effects, so if you had 5 backups, you could start the turn off by literally just for free clearing something off the board, which was pretty huge. Opus 6 Zidane actually helps kind of keep the opponent's hand a little clear, so this is kind of ironic that it's in the Wind Earth package, but this also does help discard problematic cards from the opponent's hand. Opus 5e Stola actually helps prevent anything that your opponent wants to do to try to claw back. You can kind of just say, nope, I don't want you to be able to do that. And truthfully, some people would argue that Earthwind was actually the strongest deck in the game at the time, and it's clear as to why. So into this matchup, Mono Ice just kind of has one plan, right? Discard your opponent's cards, and once you strip away your opponent's cards, you can remove the options that they need to get set up with their key pieces. Because Earthwind does require some of this setup, Mono Ice gets the jump on them and just starts getting rid of resources before that setup gets complete. Another deck that was very important at the time was Mono Water Fusoya. So this is kind of all centered around the Opus 2 Fusoya backup. So he essentially can dull down, choose a forward, and deal it 7k. In return, he does have to deal you a point of damage, but that's kind of negligible. As long as you can keep the board clear, you can play out your forwards, multiple forwards at a time. You can dish out more than 7 damage before you can receive 7 damage a lot of times. So Opus 6 Layla and Opus 4 Viking do make an appearance here. Very, very good because they allow you to generate a board, generate some resources all at the same time. So Layla bringing back Viking. Once Viking enters, you draw a card, and you could even use your own Fusoya to ping your own Viking to draw a card if you were really hungry for certain pieces, right? We also do have multiple ways to get the Viking back on board, not only the Layla, but we do have the Scholar here. And then we have ways to remove it, which is kind of the more important piece, right? Not only does Fusoya remove it, but Famfrit lets us remove it, Leviathan lets us bounce it. Just a multitude of ways to kind of help keep our draw flowing against that Mono Ice deck that's going to be discarding all of our cards anyways. We do have Opus 5 Cloud of Darkness here at our top end. So she is essentially the reason that we're going to seal the deal in this matchup. The name of the game here is just creating an opening to be able to get your damage in faster, and Cloud of Darkness really helps do that. So obviously into this matchup, Mono Ice has, again, one plan: discard your opponent's cards, right? So Mono Water Fusoya does take a few turns to get set up, and if Mono Ice can take away those resources, it really puts Fusoya behind. Although it's not impossible to keep things going, it's just a lot harder, of course. And then the last deck that I want to bring up here is actually going to be Wind Water YRP. And you could argue that this is actually Yuri Riku Pain, but notoriously it's considered Yuna Riku Pain. The whole idea here is that with Yuna Riku, Pain becomes absolutely bonkers to play. When she enters the field, if you control Riku, she literally just reactivates the 3 backups, and then she gets to draw a card. So if you go back to the beginning of our video when we talk about our effective cost, Pain is going to cost us 2 CP from the hand if we tap down 3 backups, right? So she's going to remove 2 CP from our hand to appear on the field, but then she's going to reactivate those 3 backups and draw us a card. So she is true 0 CP costed. You are generating a body for 0 CP as long as you have Riku and Yuna on the field. But you do have this very, very new tech piece in Opus 7, the Light Yuri. So he has 4 very busted effects here. So for dulling himself and 2 active backups that are the same element, or 3 active backups of the same element, just whichever way is more beneficial to you, you can either draw a card, deal something 4k, dull and freeze something, or make a forward lose all of its abilities. And this isn't once per turn, which makes it really interesting when you have all of these different ways to actually reactivate your backups. If we look at something like the Opus 1 Starter Veil 4, if we look at Opus 5 Diabolos, if we look at Opus 7 Vada, if we look at Opus 1 Bartz, we have all these ways to just not only refund ourselves the CP that we're playing, but we have ways to just bust Yuri wide open. And I will say a final note about this deck is it truthfully feels like this is one of the better options to deal with mono ice. Chalinka in Opus 7 breaks a forward or a monster, which is very, very powerful to being able to break the Gasper. Opus 5 Porum can actually cancel an action ability, so it could stop the Gasper from doling. And then Opus 3 Zidane just kind of helps keep things out of the hand, which is really nice as well. So going on with this matchup, Mono Ice, guess what, has one plan. Get set up before the opponent does. Well, by getting set up, we're really just discarding our opponent's cards anyway, so it's still ultimately the same thing, but just stripping away resources is the name of the game here. So no matter which way you slice it, Mono Ice truthfully had one plan, and it was to remove cards from our opponent's arsenal, which truthfully is exhausting to play against and not in a fun way. So the general consensus was that playing Mono Ice wasn't fun, and many players felt that even playing with Mono Ice wasn't fun. Hopefully you can kind of grasp how devastating this style of deck can be in a metagame. This deck was considered something that you had to be able to compete with, or else you may as well not even try. Can this 50 card pile beat Mono Ice? If the answer to that wasn't a confident yes, then it really deterred people from innovating on new ideas. So now let's zoom out a little bit further and let's take a look at what these cards would look like in today's metagame. Since the banning of Gasper and Thaumaturge, we've seen Opus 7 through Opus 22. 16 expansions of the game have been released, and we've seen some cards that conceptually mirror Gasper and Thaumaturge, albeit in modified ways. So comparing to Thaumaturge, in Opus 12 we had a standard unit Gunbreaker that prompts discard when party attacks. Getting multiples out of these on the field could be very devastating in the right scenario. Effectively, once per turn you're able to discard multiple cards from the opponent's hand. In Opus 17 we had the standard unit Scholar that prompts a discard as an ETB as long as you pay 1 ICP. In Opus 21, we have a standard unit called Reaper that prompts a discard or breaks a dull forward of cost 3 or less. Compared to Gasper, in Opus 8, we had Scaletoad, a 3CP monster, punishing your opponent for not playing out their hand. Opus 16, we got Unaleska, a 2CP backup, costing you a card in the hand. You can force a discard. I feel like this is the thing that they wanted Gasper to ultimately be replaced with, because the effect structure is slightly different, and this is a little bit more fair way to play the Gasper style card. In Opus 21 we did have Griever as well, a 6CP forward, and when built to abuse can really force the opponent to discard multiple times per turn. And then we have cards that just supplement the discard plan all around. We have Opus 20 Rufus, we have Opus 18 Nero and Weiss, we have Opus 16 Laswell, we have Opus 15 Orphan, and more of these cards have come out. And even at Worlds, in Opus 21, when we had Worlds in 2023, we saw 100 Ants actually take a Mono Ice deck that was built around Sky Serpent Rugagine and Opus 20 Rufus. The idea being that when Rufus enters, you force them to discard, you attack with Rugagine, you make Rufus have haste, you get to attack again, and effectively 2 discards on turn 1, and then you could pair that with something like the Opus 21 Lufinian, I believe it's Opus 21, where they have to discard if it's the only backup that you have. So it really puts your opponent so far behind, and it's just really hard to recover after that. So in my opinion, I truthfully do believe that in today's world, Gasper would definitely be a potential threat. Even with all the monster destruction that we have now, it's not enough, I don't think. It still seems too rough to bring back. Wind and recent sets have gotten several cards that activate characters, which means Gasper could be even more obnoxious. Thaumaturge does seem like less of a potential threat, honestly. We have a lot of effects that just make the opponent discard a card. I wouldn't be too worried about that. I just really think that the most potential issue is that now we would have 3 more over the course of a game that you could just dish out in a single turn. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on Gasper and Thaumaturge. Do you have first-hand experience with them? Do you have first-hand experience against them? Do you think that they would be safe to be unbanned, or are they still too far ahead for their time? I really appreciate you guys hanging out and listening to me today. I've loved researching this video, and if you'd like to see more of these, please let me know down in the comments below. Until our next video, see you guys.